All right, welcome back to the deep dive.
Good to be back.
Yeah, always good to good to be back with you, and good to be back with all the listeners out there. So today we are diving into well, a really creepy and chilling historical mystery: the Villisca Axe Murders in Iowa.
Ooh, that one's a classic.
It is. It is. It's one of those stories that you hear about, and it sticks with you. And
Yeah.
I think part of the reason it sticks with you is because, it happened in so seemingly, like ordinary, Midwestern town.
Mm-hmm.
And also because it just remains unsolved.
Right, right. I mean, that always adds to the mystery, right? Like who
Yeah,
who
absolutely.
could have done this and why?
Yeah.
And they never caught them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really captures, captures the imagination
Yeah.
because it just seems so, so inexplicable. So the Villisca Axe Murders happened on the night of June 9th, going into June 10th, 1912. And as I said, this was in Villisca, Iowa, which was a very small town. And it involved the Moore family. So Josiah Moore and his wife Sarah and their 4 children, Herman, Mary Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. And then there were also two young girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who were sleeping over that night. They were friends of the family, neighbors. So in total, 8 people.
Wow.
Were found murdered
In the house.
in the house
With an axe.
with an axe. And it is, as we said, it's over a century. We're way past a century at this point, and it's still unsolved.
It's crazy.
It's crazy. And so we have, we've done our research. We've been looking at some great sources. We've got Danny Chase's The Villisca Axe Murders. We've got the U.S. Ghost Adventures page on the Villisca Axe Murder House. We've got some really interesting coverage from the Des Moines Register. And of course, there's always the Wikipedia entry.
Of course. Yeah, the classic Wikipedia.
The classic Wikipedia. But yeah. So, we're going to go through all these different sources and kind of try to put the pieces together and really try to understand, not only, what happened, and we'll get into some of the really kind of gruesome details of the crime itself, but also, how the investigation was conducted and why it ultimately failed. And then, of course, we'll look at some of the suspects and some of the theories that have been put forward over the years.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, too, to think about this case within the context of its time, right?
Right.
Like you said, 1912,
Yep.
forensics.
Yeah.
Were not what they are today.
No.
So much has changed in terms of how we investigate crimes.
Absolutely, yeah. We're gonna get into all of that. But I think a good place to start is actually with, with the victims themselves. Let's paint a picture of who these people were. So, as I mentioned, there was Josiah Moore. He was 43 years old. He was a prominent businessman in the community. He owned a farm implement business. He was doing quite well.
Yeah.
By all accounts, he was a well-respected member of the community. His wife, Sarah, was 39 years old. And they had, as I said, 4 children. So Herman was the oldest. He was 11. Mary Catherine, 10. Boyd, 7. And then little Paul was just 5 years old. And they had these 2 friends, these 2 girls sleeping over, Lena and Ina Stillinger. Lena was 12, Ina was 8. They'd all gone to a Children's Day program at the church together that evening.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just heartbreaking to think about.
It's just an ordinary family.
It's an ordinary,
enjoying their lives and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
this horrific thing.
going about their lives, going about their day. Yeah. So, they went to this Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. That let out, it sounds like around 9:45 p.m.
Yeah.
They came back to the house, presumably, got ready for bed, went to sleep. And then sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. is when the murders are believed to have taken place.
So in the dead of night, basically
Right.
everyone's asleep. No one.
Yeah. It would have been really, really dark,
Yeah.
quiet. Villisca in 1912, I mean, you could just imagine. It was a different world. So, the next morning, a neighbor, a woman named Mary Peckham, she noticed that the Moores weren't up and about like they usually were. They weren't doing their chores, things like that. And she thought that was kind of strange.
Yeah.
So she went over to the house. She knocked on the door. Nobody answered.
No answer.
No answer. Doors were locked. And this was unusual.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't how the Moores normally operated. So she even let their chickens out of the coop.
Yeah.
Because she was just concerned.
Yeah.
Something seemed off. So she contacted Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, and said, hey, something's not right here. So Ross Moore came over.
It's like a small town. Everybody knows everybody.
Everybody knows
Yeah.
everybody.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. And so Ross, he came over to the house, and he also found it, eerily quiet. The doors were locked. And so he had a key, and he let himself in, and he went through the house. It was, totally silent.
Mhm.
And tragically, he discovered the bodies of Lena and Ina Stillinger in the guest bedroom downstairs.
Mhm.
And so he immediately, told Mary Peckham to go get the town marshal, a man named Henry Horton.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so, Henry Horton came over. And his initial assessment, and this is a quote that has really stuck with people. He said, "Somebody was murdered in every bed." Chilling. Yeah. And it really just kind of gives you a sense of the, the scope of the horror that he walked into. 8 people bludgeoned to death in their beds.
And the murder weapon was
A murder weapon
that was in the house.
If a murder weapon was in the house, it was Josiah Moore's own axe. And it was found leaning against the wall in that guest room where the Stillinger sisters were found. And so I mean, just right off the bat, you have this incredibly gruesome scene, and it immediately sets the stage for this really dark mystery. And then on top of that, there were all these really strange details at the crime scene that have fueled speculation for decades.
Like what kind of strange detail?
Yeah. So for example, there was a 4-pound slab of bacon
Wait, what?
just sitting next to the axe.
Next to the axe. Yeah.
Next to the axe. Now, some people have speculated that this was some kind of a ritualistic thing. Maybe the killer was trying to, throw off the investigation or something. But to this day, nobody really knows why that bacon was there.
That's so bizarre.
So bizarre. Then you've got mirrors throughout the entire house that were covered with clothing.
Really?
Yeah. And again, there's all kinds of theories about this. Some people think that the killer might have been superstitious
Oh, interesting.
about mirrors. There's that old superstition that if you break a mirror, you get 7 years of bad luck.
Right.
And so maybe, they didn't want to see their own reflection in the mirror, or maybe they didn't want the victims to be able to, see them.
See their attacker.
Yeah, see their attacker. Yeah. But again, we're just speculating. Nobody really knows for sure. Then you've got untouched food on the kitchen table. It's like the family was just about to sit down for breakfast.
Oh, wow.
But then they never did. And there was a bowl of bloody water in the kitchen sink.
So someone tried to clean up.
Yeah, definitely seems like somebody tried to clean up. Now, there's also some accounts that mention spent cigarettes being found in the attic.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but there's actually some discrepancy about this. Like I said, we looked at the U.S. Ghost Adventures page on the Villisca Axe Murder House, and they actually state that no cigarettes were found.
Huh. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, maybe this is just a case of, the story changing over time, like a game of telephone.
Yeah.
Or maybe there was something there and it was just never officially, documented. Who knows?
It is interesting how stories can evolve and change, especially with a case like this that has so much mystery and intrigue surrounding it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, you look at the condition of the bodies themselves, and it's just brutal. All 8 victims, they suffered severe head wounds from the axe. Josiah Moore, the father, he actually received the most blows. It was, really, really vicious. And they determined that the blade of the axe was used on him and on his wife, Sarah. But then the blunt end of the axe seems to have been used on the children and the Stillinger girls.
Oh, that's awful.
It is. And one of the things that investigators really focused on was the case of Lena Stillinger, because she was found lying crosswise on the bed, and she had a defensive wound on her arm, which suggests that she may have been awake and may have tried to fight back.
Oh, so scary.
Yeah. And then on top of that, her body had been moved. Her undergarments had been removed.
Right.
And one of her legs was actually positioned in a way that exposed her genitalia. Now, this obviously led to a lot of speculation at the time that there may have been sexual assault involved. However, it's important to note that later investigations, even though they didn't have the sophisticated forensic techniques that we have today, they were able to determine that there was no actual evidence of sexual molestation.
So that was more just speculation based on how she was found.
Yeah. And I think it really speaks to, the limitations of the investigation at the time, but also just the chaos and the kind of, the way that people were trying to make sense of this horrible, horrible crime. And one of the things that I think is so unsettling is that none of the neighbors reported hearing anything unusual during the night.
Really?
Yeah. You got 8 people murdered with an axe,
And no one heard a thing.
and no one heard a thing. And, as we said, it was a small town.
Right.
It would have been quiet.
Like quiet.
And yet, nothing.
That's so strange.
It is. And
Yeah.
it's just one of the many, many, kind of chilling aspects of this whole case. So let's talk about the investigation itself, because as you alluded to earlier, this is, this is 1912. This is not CSI. They don't have the fancy tools and the techniques that we have today.
Right. No DNA testing?
No DNA testing. No real, sophisticated fingerprinting or anything like that.
So how do they even approach an investigation like this back then?
Well, and that's actually a huge part of the problem.
Oh, okay.
Because the crime scene was essentially contaminated from the moment the bodies were discovered.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Word spread like wildfire. And before the authorities could even, really get there and secure the scene, you had townspeople just wandering in and out of the house.
Oh, my gosh. Really?
Yeah. They were looking at the bodies. They were handling the axe. Some people even took, pieces of Josiah's skull as souvenirs.
That's morbid. It's morbid.
So they were just letting anybody
They're just letting anybody in.
into the crime scene. Into the crime scene.
Wow.
Yeah. It's really hard to fathom by today's standards. But this was in a different time. And it took hours for the county sheriff to arrive. And then it took even longer for the National Guard to be called in to finally secure the scene.
Yeah.
And by that point, any potential trace evidence, fingerprints, footprints, fibers, anything like that, it was almost certainly, compromised.
Right. So the crime scene was completely compromised.
Totally compromised.
From the beginning.
Yeah. And then, as we said, they didn't have modern forensics. So, there was some speculation at the time that maybe the family had been poisoned, that maybe there were sedatives in their milk or their cocoa or something like that. But toxicology testing was not a routine part of investigations back then.
So they couldn't even really test for that.
They couldn't really test for it, no.
Yeah.
So, that whole line of inquiry basically just kind of, went nowhere.
Wow. So they were really working with very little.
Very little to go on.
Yeah.
But, they did find some things. They found, an imprint in the hay in the barn near a knothole, which suggested that somebody might have been watching the family.
Oh, that's creepy.
It is. It is. And they also found, as we talked about, the possible Spence cigarettes in the attic. And then there was also a gas lamp upstairs that had the chimney removed and the wick turned really low, like somebody was trying to, minimize the amount of light.
Trying to hide.
Yeah, trying to hide. And they also found a keychain fragment that didn't belong to anybody in the family.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, they had these little pieces.
These little clues.
Yeah, these little clues. But, without the ability to really process them, it was very difficult to make any real headway.
Mm.
So given all of this, given the lack of, hard evidence, given the botched investigation, it's really not surprising that all kinds of suspects and theories have emerged over the years. And, I think one of the most interesting and one of the most unsettling figures in this whole story is Reverend George Kelly.
I've heard that name before.
Yeah. So he was a traveling Methodist minister, and he was actually in Villisca to conduct those Children's Day services that the Moore family and the Stillinger girls attended.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then the next morning, he left town very early, like before anybody even knew that the murders had taken place.
That's suspicious.
It is. And there were actually some people on the train with him who claimed that he was talking about 8 people being murdered in Villisca.
What? He was just like openly talking about it?
Yeah. And this was before, the news had spread or anything.
Wow.
So that obviously raised a lot of red flags.
Yeah.
And then months later, he actually confessed to the murders.
He confessed.
Yeah. He said that God had told him to suffer the children to come unto me.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. But then, of course, he recanted that confession at his trial. And despite all the kind of circumstantial evidence and his own confession and then recanting, he was actually acquitted.
He was acquitted.
He was acquitted in 2 separate trials.
Wow.
Yeah. But then, to make matters even weirder, he was later arrested and convicted for sending obscene material through the mail.
So clearly not.
Not a great guy.
Not a great guy.
Yeah. So, it really makes you wonder.
Right. Like, what was his involvement?
Yeah, exactly. Then you have another suspect, Frank F. Jones. Now, he was a prominent businessman in Villisca. He was actually Josiah Moore's former employer, and he was also a state senator, so he was a powerful guy.
Powerful guy.
Powerful guy. And, the theory here is that he had a motive because Josiah Moore had left his business and started his own very successful farm implement business. And not only that, but Moore had actually secured this really lucrative John Deere contract, which basically, really hurt Jones's business.
So we had a financial motive.
Financial motive, yeah. And then there were also some rumors at the time, although they were never substantiated, that there may have been an affair between Josiah Moore and Jones's daughter-in-law.
Ooh, that's juicy.
Yeah. So, it's possible that Jones, hired somebody to carry out the murders. But again, there's no direct evidence linking him to the crime.
Right.
And then you have a really, really interesting suspect, a guy named William Insane Blackie Mansfield. Now, this guy was an ex-convict. He was a former U.S. Army soldier. And he was linked to some other axe murders that happened around the same time in Colorado Springs and in Pella, Kansas.
Oh, wow. So possibly a serial killer.
Possibly a serial killer, yeah. And there were a lot of similarities between those crimes and the Villisca murders. The windows were covered, the axe was wiped clean, the victims' heads were covered.
So similar MO.
Very similar MO.
Yeah.
And there was a detective, James Newton Wilkerson, who really became convinced that Mansfield was the killer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And Wilkerson, he had this whole theory that Mansfield was a cocaine addict and that he was going around the country committing these axe murders.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he pointed to, these consistent elements like the covered mirrors, the lamp with the chimney off, the evidence of washing in the kitchen, the fact that the killer probably wore gloves, all these things that seemed to connect these different crimes. And so he actually arrested Mansfield, and there was a grand jury inquiry. But Mansfield had an alibi.
She had an alibi.
Yeah, he had payroll records that seemed to put him in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. And so he was released. And he actually sued Wilkerson for slander and won.
Wow. So they couldn't definitively place him at the scene?
No, they couldn't. But there was this really interesting little wrinkle.
Oh.
Yeah. So there was a restaurant owner named R.H. Thorpe, and he claimed that he had seen Mansfield boarding a train in a town not far from Villisca on the morning after the murders. And he said that Mansfield had walked there from Villisca.
So that would contradict his alibi.
It would. And, if Thorpe's story is true, then it means that Mansfield could have traveled to Villisca, committed the murders, and then gotten back to Illinois in time to, be accounted for in those payroll records.
So it's still possible he could have been the one.
Yeah, it's still possible. And then, of course, you have Henry Lee Moore. Now, he was no relation to the Moore family from Villisca.
Okay.
But he was a suspected serial killer. And he was actually convicted of murdering his own mother and grandmother with an axe just a few months after the Villisca murders. So, obviously that raised a lot of eyebrows. And there's been some speculation that he may have been involved in other unsolved axe murders from that era.
Right, because of the similar MO.
Yeah, the similar MO. And then there was also a guy named Samuel R. Moyer, who was Josiah Moore's brother-in-law. And there were some reports that he had made threats against Josiah.
Oh.
So he was definitely a suspect early on. But he had a pretty solid alibi, and so he was ultimately, cleared.
Okay.
And then, more recently, there's been a really fascinating theory put forward by Bill James in his book, The Man from the Train. And this theory posits that there was a single serial killer who was responsible for a whole bunch of axe murders across the United States, primarily near railway lines.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And James and his daughter Rachel, they did all this research, and they identified this really compelling pattern. So these murders, they would typically target families. They'd happen near train tracks. They would happen around midnight while the victims were asleep. The killer would use the blunt side of an axe. They would cover the victims' faces. They would cover the windows in the house. They would lock the doors from the inside. And there was often, at least the suggestion of a sexual motive, especially in cases involving young girls.
So this theory ties together a lot of different cases.
It does, yeah. And they actually link this mysterious killer, the man from the train, to at least 59 deaths across 14 incidents over a decade.
59 deaths.
Yeah. And that includes the axe murders in Colorado Springs and Cheola that we talked about earlier. And, one of the key things here is the proximity to railway lines, because that would have allowed the killer to travel all over the country without, being easily detected.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. And so this theory has really gained a lot of traction in recent years because it kind of explains why the Villisca murders have never been solved.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't somebody from Villisca at all. Maybe it was this transient serial killer who was just passing through.
That's a chilling thought.
It is. It is. So, the house itself has obviously become a bit of a landmark. It's known as the Villisca Axe Murder House. And in the 1990s, it was actually restored to its 1912 condition.
Oh, wow. So they kept it.
They kept it
Yeah.
as it was.
And today it's a tourist attraction. People can go there, they can take tours, and they can even spend the night.
Oh my gosh. Would you spend the night?
I don't, if I could.
Yeah. That's a little creepy for me, I think.
It's a little creepy. But, I guess some people are drawn to that kind of, that kind of darkness. And it's definitely marketed as a haunted location.
Yeah, I can see why.
Yeah. So, we've gone through a lot of information here. We've talked about the victims. We've talked about the crime scene, the investigation, the suspects, the theories. It's a really complex case. And, I think what's so fascinating about it is that it really does remain a mystery.
Right. We still don't know for sure who did it.
We don't know for sure who did it. And it's interesting because even the name of the town, Villisca, it originally meant pretty place.
Oh, how ironic.
Ironic, right. But after the murders, some people started calling it Walliska, which means evil place.
And it really speaks to the way that this crime kind of cast a shadow over the entire community.
Yeah, it really changed people's perceptions.
Yeah. So, we've looked at all these different possibilities, everything from, personal grudges to business rivalries to traveling serial killers and even, the possibility of the paranormal.
Right. It could be any of those things.
It could be any of those things. What do you think? What explanation resonates most with you?
I think, for me, the man from the train theory is really compelling. Just the amount of research that went into it and the fact that it connects all these seemingly unrelated cases, it's hard to ignore that.
Yeah, it's hard to ignore. And it's definitely one of those theories that, it really makes you think. So to all of you listening out there, we've shared all this information with you. We've really tried to delve into this mystery. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide what you believe. What aspects of this case do you find most unsettling? And what do you think it tells us about our fascination with the unknown, with unsolved crimes? Maybe this deep dive will inspire you to do some more research on your own, to learn more about the suspects, to learn more about that era in American history. There's a lot to unpack here. And I think that's part of what makes this case so enduringly fascinating.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us on the deep dive, and we will see you next time.
See you later.